start, if you just explain who you are and kind of what you do.
Sure. I'm Alan Black. I'm an assistant professor in the geography department here at SIUE, and I am a meteorologist and climatologist.
Awesome. So, what is your education, expertise, experience?
Um, wow, good question. So I got my PhD in geography at the University of Georgia. Before that, I got a Master's of Science in Geography and a Bachelor's of Science in Meteorology, both from Northern Illinois University. And so my research is really focused on extreme weather. I look at the impacts of weather on transportation. I look at climate change, and I look at extreme flooding events. I look at windstorms. I have a lot of interest. And so I sort of work on a lot of topics that are not necessarily very similar, but they're all related through the idea of climate change, and climate impacts. You know, how do these events impact people? That's really what I'm interested in.
Is that, out of all those, is climate change, is that the one that's most important, I think?
Um, it's I don't know if it's most important.
More to you, not just overall, maybe just to you.
Yeah, it's certainly a question that weighs on my mind quite a bit. But I'm interested in, I mean, we know that climate's changing. I'm interested in the human impacts part of it more than anything. So if you know, climate is changing, what can we do about it? And what are the impacts going to be for us, our children, and into the future? That's the sort of thing that keeps me up at night, I guess, if you will.
Do you believe climate change is a threat to our planet?
So I do think climate change is a threat, and I think how the threat is going to manifest itself more than anything is as climate warms, we're going to see more extreme events. So they can be both hot and cold. You know, hotter summers, but perhaps deeper cold snaps like we've seen this winter. In terms of water, we expect to have more heavy rains, but yet more droughts. We expect these events to become more extreme when they do happen, and so that that is definitely going to change how we think about the world, the things that people do, things like agriculture, how we deal with water, you know, flooding, things like that. So I do think that it is a big threat to the planet, and more particularly, it's a big threat to us as people.
All right. So, what are some of the major causes of climate change?
So the big cause of climate change is the fact that we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. Climate has sort of gone through different cycles over time. But what we know, looking at the records that go back from things like ice cores, is that climate is changing more rapidly than it ever has in the past. We're now at a level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we haven't been for probably 800,000 or 900,000 years, maybe before that. And so we're now moving our climate out of a zone that we have really, that the human race has. It's the only climate we've ever known, and we're moving ourselves away from that. And so, but again, this is all because of our actions of burning fossil fuels is essentially where this is coming from.
Let's go 10, 20 years down the road. What do you see happening from climate change?
That's a great question. So 10 or 20 years from now, so what we found in the climate system is that there are tipping points. And it's sort of like it's like you've crossed a threshold that maybe you can't go back to the state that the planet was in before. And I don't know over the next 20 or 30 years if we're going to cross a threshold where we cannot go back to the climate, or maybe we'll be able to go back to it, but it'll take thousands of years. And so 20 or 30 years down the road, I think some of the things I mentioned earlier are going to really start to come into play. There's probably going to be, we have an increasing population on Earth, and that's going to put strain on resources. The resources are going to be strained from the climate perspective because we're going to be less able to grow the food to feed those people. Water will be more scarce. When it comes, it will come in these giant, it might come in these really intense flooding rains. That water then runs off, and then it doesn't stick around so that you can use it to water crops or for people to drink throughout the whole year. One of the in the western United States, one of the main sources of water resources is snow. Snowpack builds over the winter. It melts during the spring and summer. That then feeds the rivers like the Colorado and things like that, where we draw for irrigation and for drinking water, and we use it for recreation too. If that precipitation falls as rain instead of snow, it's not going to be trapped in the mountains anymore. It's going to run off right away. It's going to greatly alter the balance of the hydrologic cycle in that part of the world. And we have lots of big cities out there that depend on that water. Some of it goes to Phoenix, some of it goes to Denver, some of it goes to places like LA or Las Vegas. And you got to say, okay, well, what's going to happen to these places in the future? Are these going to remain places that we can live? And not even, and that's the water side. If we think about the temperature side, then it goes, okay, well, what are high temperatures going to look like in 20 or 30 years in Phoenix? Is the high going to be 120 degrees, 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 140 degrees? I mean, I don't know what the limit is, but it's, in 20 or 30 years, we could be looking at a planet that's drastically different than what we're used to, or a United States that's drastically different than what we're used to. It's really, it's pretty scary. Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's really hard to envision what all those impacts are because everything is so interconnected. A small change in one thing can really have a big feedback somewhere else, and we don't know what those all might be. And so we're in the middle of a giant experiment that we're conducting on ourselves, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be. So it's frightening.
So a lot of people talk about how they don't want to attack climate change because it'll be a lot of negative economic impacts. But would you see negative economic impacts happening from climate change in the future?
Oh, sure. I mean, so, it's the old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we might spend billions or maybe trillions of dollars doing things to switch over to more green energy, burn less fossil fuels, things like that. But we have to think also, and I'm not an economist, but we have to think also about the money that we would save, instead of having to mitigate against things like sea level rise. Things like mitigating for extreme flooding, making water resources and figuring out how to feed the people, making water resources available for drinking, figuring out how to feed people under these scenarios. And so I think, I think we're better off to take action sooner. It might be costly. It's going to cost more later. We have, oftentimes already in the U.S., we have 10, 20, $30 billion weather disasters, disasters that cause at least $1 billion in damage each year. So how many more of those can we take? What is it going to be, 100 a year, 150 a year? I don't know, but at some point that becomes an unsustainable number.
Do you think there are any misconceptions about climate change?
I think, yes, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about climate change. For a long time, there was a whole denial about the fact that climate was changing at all. And then it sort of shifted over time to, well, it's changing, but it's due to the natural cycles. There are natural cycles in climate, and they manifest themselves over tens of thousands of years, not over the 100 or 150 years that we've been altering the climate by burning things like coal and other fossil fuels. And so... I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. I think the other biggest misconception is that if we, that maybe we shouldn't spend the money to mitigate it now, and we'll just deal with those consequences in the future. And I think from an economic and sustainability point of view, that doesn't make any sense. It's almost as if it's just like, well, we're not going to deal with it because it could be costly, but there's no plan. That's the whole plan. You know what I mean? It's like, well, we're going to have to deal with this one way or the other. And again, we should probably meet those challenges sooner rather than later, while we still, before we maybe get to some of those tipping points and we can't go back or stay in the climate that we've known.
How successful do you think America and the world has been at dealing with climate change?
So I don't think, I think the United States in particular has not been very successful in dealing with climate change. We haven't had any real serious climate action at the federal governmental level. But other countries are moving forward with plans to reduce greenhouse gases, regardless of what the United States is doing right now. And there have been some successes. If you drive around the state of Illinois, you're going to see wind farms in a lot of places, and that's sort of the start of a shift to a greener electrical generation and a greener economy. So I think there are some successes. I think there's lots of reasons to be hopeful. We can succeed, but again, at the scale of things that need to happen to really avert this crisis that's coming, it needs to be directed from a higher level. It needs to come from the federal level down. But people can affect that at the grassroots level by asking their representatives to think about this and really voting. If people believe this is a problem, they should identify candidates who agree with that stance and vote appropriately. So that's probably the number one way that we can affect change on an individual basis.
Yeah, that was kind of going to my next question about like what are some good potential solutions to climate change?
Sure. So solutions to climate change, again, I think the number one thing is that to mitigate this successfully, this needs to the interventions need to come from the federal level. They need to be dictated by laws, and so we need to vote. But individually, we can all have some impact just by conserving energy, conserving gasoline and things like that, not driving when you don't have to, turn off the lights, doing things like that. Now, I only probably, flying is a big emitter of greenhouse gas. I probably try to fly once a year or less if I can avoid it. So just all of those things over time can have an impact. If 300 million of us do something, there's going to be an impact. Another one that's big and people don't want to hear is to just reduce the amount of meat that people eat. There's a lot of ranching and meat production is very energy intensive. It's very water intensive. It emits a lot of greenhouse gases in the process. And so that's something, even if you remove meat from just one meal a week, it has a huge impact, especially if we're all doing it.
Right.
So.
I guess good. So do you have like a future outlook or how, kind of more like a prediction of how you think things are going to go?
Again, I think there's reason to be hopeful that we can meet the challenge of climate change and mitigate it before the consequences become really, really dire. It's hard to say. If we globally took action, and a lot of action today to mitigate climate change, we could limit the planet's warming to maybe a degree or 2 Celsius. The further we delay that, the worse, the warmer it's going to be and the worse the impacts will be. And so, but it's hard to predict specifically what that's going to look like in 30 to 50 years. We might not see, the impacts might not be as dire by the middle of the century, but they might be even worse by the end of the century. There's some models that indicate that, 2050 might not be a whole lot different than what we're seeing now. But 2100 might be a whole lot different than both 2050 and 2019.